Can you believe there was a time, less than 150 years ago, when the difference between a warm bed and becoming an instant frozen statue was a single rickety iron box fueled by dry pine? We are not talking about a little chill. We are talking about the true, unadulterated, screaming cold of Siberia, 1880. A place where the air itself was a weapon, designed to shatter bone and freeze the moisture in your very breath before it even left your lungs. This is the story of the forgotten frontier, a land so vast and hostile that merely existing was an act of defiant, bloody warfare. Picture this: temperatures plunging past -50 degrees Celsius, a deadly vacuum where the sun was nothing more than a pale, useless suggestion on the horizon. A catastrophe no one saw coming? No. This catastrophe was always coming, every single autumn, waiting patiently for the ice to seal the fate of entire communities. The villagers of Krasny Yar and Nizhnaya were pioneers, yes, but they were also prisoners of the permafrost. Their entire universe shrunk to the confines of 4 heavily insulated log walls, the izba. And at the absolute terrifying heart of that fragile existence, sitting like a silent, hungry god, was the pechka, the wood stove. This furnace wasn't just for cooking. It was the life support machine of an entire civilization, a glowing orange sanctuary against a world that actively, mathematically, demanded their death. Imagine the fear, the sheer, crushing dread that accompanied the sound of the wind howling outside. A sound that didn't just rattle the windows, but seemed to claw at the very timber structure, promising obliteration. Every family knew the gruesome truth. If the pechka died, they followed within hours. There was no rescue, no modern emergency service, just the swift, brutal embrace of the Siberian void. We are going to peel back the layers of this frozen epic, an extreme survival saga where architecture became the ultimate battlefield. How did these villages survive? They engineered their homes into thermal fortresses. Forget aesthetics. Survival was built from density. The insulation wasn't cotton or fiberglass. It was pure, heavy, layered earth. We're talking thick moss stuffed into every crevice, clay chinking sealing the massive hand-hewn logs, and roofs so weighty with packed snow and sod that they looked less like shelters and more like burial mounds rising from the ice. But the true genius lay in the design, the airlock system. Every door was a double door, sometimes triple, creating small, trapped pockets of air, the tambour, where the killer cold could be momentarily stalled, confused, and defeated before it breached the inner sanctum. This wasn't just smart building. It was tactical genius applied to thermodynamics. A desperate mathematical equation solved by brute force and fear. Yet, even the most perfect insulation is useless without heat. And that's where the pechka took center stage. This massive brick and clay monster wasn't a standard fireplace. It was an elaborate heat retention machine, often weighing hundreds of kilograms, built directly into the center of the hut. It was the absolute, non-negotiable focal point of life. Children slept directly on top of it, wrapped in sheepskins, absorbing the blessed, radiant warmth that seeped into the very fibers of their being.
The drama, however, wasn't about the heat it provided, but the terrifying logistics required to feed the beast. Every single day, the fuel had to be procured. In the summer, this was a relentless, back-breaking chore, chopping, drying, stacking, praying the harvest would last through the 8 months of relentless winter darkness. Wood was literally currency. It was life, and the supply lines were always on the brink of collapse.
Imagine a silent treaty governing every action: waste no heat. Every door opening was a mortal sin, every misplaced piece of kindling a near-death experience. The oldest members of the community were the guardians of the fire, the engineers of the slow burn, teaching the younger generation the forbidden art of coaxing 12 hours of life from a handful of carefully placed logs. But what happens when the snow falls so deep it buries the caches of firewood? What happens when the great Siberian winds, known locally as the breath of the dead, rip through the taiga, making the simple act of fetching water from the ice hole a fatal expedition? This is when the true terror began to set in, the slow realization that the fragile balance had tipped and the wood reserves were dwindling faster than anticipated. We are about to plunge into the winter of 1883, an infamous year whispered about in hushed tones across generations, when the cold didn't just drop, it fell. It was a year when the price of a single axe stroke was measured not in rubles, but in frostbite and potentially life itself. The air became so dry and brittle that static electricity was a constant threat, and every spark from the pechka carried the horrifying potential for mass annihilation. Because the irony of the situation was a cruel joke played by nature, the very thing keeping them alive, the fire, was their second biggest threat. An overzealous stoking, a crack in the ancient clay chimney, a careless cinder landing on the dry moss insulation, and the izba would become a flashpoint, transforming the sanctuary into a roaring, beautiful funeral pyre in minutes. And in that sub-zero chaos, there was no time to escape. You either froze inside the wooden fortress, or you burned inside the wooden fortress. The choices were limited, terrifying, and enforced by the merciless rules of physics. This is the story of the thin red line maintained by smoke and sweat, the desperate, heroic battle of the Siberian hearth against the endless, hungry white. Prepare yourself, because the silence of the Siberian winter is about to be shattered by the sound of desperation, the cracking of frozen timbers, and the constant, rhythmic, terrifying sound of the axe splitting wood. The axe sings its desperate song, a metallic shriek against the crushing white silence, a sound that echoes the rhythm of existence itself. Every swing is a prayer, every split log a reprieve. But the reprieve is measured in hours, not days. The woodpile outside the izba, that small, pathetic mountain of frozen life, is the ultimate barometer of survival. When it shrinks too low, the whispering fear of the cold turns into a screaming panic because the great enemy does not negotiate, and its siege is absolute. The survival of the family hinges entirely on two interconnected, high-stakes engineering marvels: the shield and the heart.
First, the shield. Look closer at the structure that holds the line. This isn't just a shack thrown together. The izba is an architectural masterpiece born of existential dread, a fortress designed specifically to defy physics and atmospheric violence. It is built deliberately low to the ground, often with the first course of logs partially submerged into the frozen earth, not for aesthetics, but to steal the Earth's meager geothermal warmth and shield itself from the catastrophic wind-driven chill that can drop the effective temperature by another 20 degrees in a single terrifying gust. The walls are massive, utilizing the technique of horizontal log construction, carefully notched and interlocked with dovetail joints that become tighter as the wood shrinks and freezes. This creates a dense, self-supporting timber shell, impervious to the relentless pressure of the snow load and the constant thermal shock. But the true defense, the dark magic of the izba, lies in the insulation. This village doesn't use modern fiberglass. They use necessity. Moss, clay, and sometimes even frozen, dried animal tongue are painstakingly packed into every single crack and crevice, sealing the structure against the lethal infiltration of wind, a process known chillingly as winterizing the coffin. The windows, they are the weakest points in the defense and treated with justifiable paranoia. They are tiny, strategically placed apertures, almost always triple-paned, with layers of heavy, dense mica, or in poorer homes, thick, frozen animal bladders. Anything to block the heat from radiating out into the murderous vacuum. A large window here isn't a luxury of light. It's a guaranteed death sentence, a thermal breach the family cannot survive. The light inside is always dim, because every photon of sun gained is not worth the thermal leakage it invites. And at the center of this frozen citadel sits the undisputed sovereign, the terrifying, life-giving deity that demands constant sacrifice. The pechka. It is not merely a stove. It is the ultimate thermal engine, a furnace, an oven, a bed, a dryer, and a concrete hard wall of survival, often taking up a quarter of the entire living space. This behemoth isn't made of thin, flimsy cast iron that radiates heat quickly and cools just as fast. No, the pechka is built of heavy, dense, refractory clay and brick, often insulated with rock and earth, designed for one purpose only: thermal mass, the storage of heat energy so vast it defies the ambient cold. You don't heat the air in the izba. The heated air escapes too quickly, regardless of the quality of the insulation. Instead, they heat the mass of the pechka itself. The family feeds it a massive charge of wood, a roaring, infernal blaze that could consume the house in minutes if mismanaged, turning the bricks white hot. The critical, life-altering moment comes when the fire has burned down to glowing coals and the brick mass is fully saturated with heat. The head of the household must then
And this is the most paralyzing moment of the day. Close the damper at the exact right second. Too soon, and deadly carbon monoxide, the silent killer, fills the room, displacing the oxygen and putting the entire family into a permanent, painless, icy slumber. Too late, and the precious, hard-earned heat screams up the chimney and vanishes into the sub-zero void, forcing the family to burn even more of their finite, life-saving supply of wood. This precise timing, balancing the thermal charge against the risk of poisoning, is the most critical calculation of their day, a moment of profound, paralyzing risk, a desperate game played every single evening against death. The goal is to charge that dense brick core with enough energy to slowly radiate heat back into the house for a relentless 12 to 18 hours, keeping the interior temperature hovering just above freezing, a glorious 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the sweet spot of survival, while the outside plunges to -50. But this immense thermal battery demands an astronomical price: wood. The fuel is not a commodity, it is compressed time. A small family izba in the deepest Siberian winter requires conservatively nearly 2 to 3 cords of prepared hardwood per month just to maintain this fragile, frozen equilibrium. To put that into terrifying context, a single cord of wood represents weeks of back-breaking labor in conditions that kill the weak and break the strong, felling trees, hauling them back through meters of snow, and splitting them by hand while exposed to frostbite that can steal fingers and toes in minutes. This isn't fire prevention. This is a daily logistical war against entropy and resource depletion. Every single piece of wood burned is a piece that must be replaced. The moment the supply chain breaks, the moment sickness or injury stops the axe, the countdown to zero begins, swift and irreversible, measured in the diminishing glow of the pechka. The children know this silent, terrifying truth. They see the fear in their father's eyes as he measures the stack, knowing that if the wood runs out, the pechka will grow cold, and the insulated izba will become a perfect, high-tech tomb, preserving their frozen forms until the spring thaw, months away. The knowledge that the pechka, their iron heart, could betray them was not an abstract terror. It was a physical, measurable threat, woven into the very fabric of their homes, the izba. Every single log, every layer of moss chinking, every thick shutter battened down against the screaming wind was a flammable potential waiting for a single spark to turn it into a pyre. They lived in houses engineered specifically to trap heat, a brilliant survival tactic. But this same thermal efficiency meant that if fire caught hold in the thick, multi-layered walls, it would spread with terrifying, unstoppable speed, consuming everything in minutes. The izba was a sealed container, perfect for living, perfect for dying, and that terrible duality hung over every single meal cooked and every log burned. The design itself was a gamble against thermodynamics, a complex equation where life equaled heat, and heat equaled the constant, gnawing possibility of catastrophic combustion. This delicate balance demanded ceaseless vigilance,
far beyond the standard fear of a hearth fire. It was the structural integrity of the entire wooden sanctuary that was perpetually at risk, minute by agonizing minute. The most vulnerable artery in this critical survival system was the truba, the chimney flue, the tall, narrow throat that exhaled the deadly smoke and gases from the pechka into the frozen atmosphere. This flue was a ticking bomb, coated internally with layers of black, tinder-dry soot and highly flammable creosote, the distilled essence of countless winter fires. This thick, oily residue, a byproduct of burning unseasoned or damp wood, became the accelerator of doom. If the fire burned too hot, perhaps fueled by a sudden, desperate addition of dry kindling, or if a downdraft occurred, that accumulated black powder could ignite in a flash, sending a tower of superheated flame roaring out of the roofline, a distress signal nobody wanted to see. The cry of "Gorit! It's burning!" was the sound of doom, echoing across the silent, snow-choked landscape, a cry that guaranteed tragedy. The maintenance of the flue was not a chore. It was a sacred, terrifying ritual, usually performed by the strongest, bravest men, often in howling gales at temperatures that could snap bone and blind exposed skin. They would ascend the icy, slippery roof, their breath freezing instantly, armed with heavy chains or specialized wire brushes, scraping the poisonous buildup from the inside of the stone or brickwork. This task was often undertaken in the relative warmth of a -30-degree day, a calculated risk taken because leaving the flue untouched meant certain fiery death later. Missing a single patch, allowing the creosote to cake too thickly, meant signing the death warrant for the entire family and perhaps the surrounding neighbors. It was a trade-off: risk freezing to death while cleaning the roof, or risk burning to death because you didn't. The stakes were absolute, unforgiving, Siberian stakes. The actual structure of the izba magnified this hazard tenfold. These were not flimsy cabins. They were fortresses built for war against the great enemy. The walls were often double-skinned, heavy, interlocked logs on the outside, and then an inner layer of planking, separated by a critical, life-saving gap. This deep, organic space was filled with natural insulating materials, dried moss, sometimes layers of clay mixed with straw, or even packed peat. This insulation was the miracle of the izba, phenomenal at maintaining the 50 degrees Celsius difference between the inside warmth and the outside hell, keeping the breath of life within the walls. But once fire reached that moss and clay core, the structure became a slow-burning ember, insulated from the outside world, impossible to extinguish without tearing the entire house apart, log by frozen log. Water was not the answer, for water was frozen rock, and melting it wasted precious time the fire would never allow. Every night, the patriarch or matriarch of the household would lie awake long after the coals settled, their senses hyper-alert, listening not for the howl of the wolf, but for the subtle, terrifying sounds of the pechka itself. A too loud crackle, a sudden shift in the airflow, the smell of scorching wood that was not supposed to be burning, These were the whispers of the great fire. They knew the danger of a hidden cinder, a spark that had somehow escaped the iron mouth of the stove and nestled itself into the dry wooden floorboards or the chinking of the wall. Sleep was a luxury afforded only to the children, oblivious to the proximity of instant annihilation. For the adults, the watch was constant, the fear a dull, permanent ache in the gut. They understood that the two greatest elements of their survival, the abundant wood fuel and the heavy organic insulation, were simultaneously the two most efficient agents of their destruction. The paradox was brutal. Survival depended on surrounding yourself with the very substance that once ignited would kill you fastest. Because water was essentially useless, frozen solid or requiring too much precious time to melt, the required response to fire in a Siberian village was brutal, swift, and immediate. Isolation and complete demolition. If a neighbor spotted the telltale smoke, the cry of "Gorit" instantly mobilized every able-bodied person in the settlement. They didn't bring useless buckets of ice. They brought heavy axes, pickaxes, and long spiked poles designed for leverage. The goal was not to save the burning house, which was already recognized as lost, but to tear down the surrounding structures with frenzied desperation, creating a gap in the flammable line of homes. The burning house, the heart of somebody's life, had to be sacrificed instantly, reduced to scattered lumber and snow-covered ruins to create a massive, undeniable firebreak. This prevented the devastating chain reaction that could wipe out the entire settlement in a single catastrophic night. This was the ultimate collective terror, the defining feature of their societal compact. Watching your neighbor's home, and perhaps all their stored winter food, their tools, their very connection to life, be deliberately destroyed by the very people sworn to protect the community. This act of necessary brutality, tearing down the walls of life to save the village's future, defined the Siberian Pact. Individual suffering for collective survival. The great enemy gave them cold. The great fire forced them to make impossible, life-shattering choices. The Siberian pechka, the wood stove that stood as the undisputed monarch of the izba, was not a comfort item. It was a heavily armed thermal battery, a brick leviathan demanding absolute, unwavering obedience from its supplicants. Its immense bulk, often weighing 2 or 3 tons of dense clay, riverstone, and compacted sand, was the critical engineering marvel that defied the Arctic's physics. This massive thermal mass didn't just burn wood, it imprisoned the energy, holding the desperate heat captive deep within its core, releasing a slow, measured, and agonizingly precious breath of warmth back into the dwelling over the course of 18 brutal hours. This was the Siberian Pact with heat, an intense burst of destructive power, followed by an enduring, gentle radiation, a life support system built of fire and earth. But the engine of life was also the harbinger of death, and the logistics of its operation were a nightly dance with disaster. The smoke vent, the chimney, the truba, was the weakest link in the entire defense system. A single, unseen hair-lined crack in the flue lining, exacerbated by the violent expansion and contraction of the cold, could turn the izba into a lethal gas chamber. That beautiful, life-giving wood smoke, the very signature of human survival, would become a toxic ghost, carbon monoxide, silently hunting the family in their sleep, guaranteeing a painless, yet absolute end. The village survived only through the vigilant terror of the Kochegar, the stoker, the designated guardian of the flame. This individual, often the patriarch or the most resilient elder, carried the physical and psychological burden of the entire family's existence. Their sleep was a luxury they could rarely afford, their nights defined by terrifying, minute-by-minute calculations concerning fuel load, airflow, and timing. Too much wood packed into the roaring furnace, and the internal temperature skyrocketed, threatening to ignite the accumulated soot and creosote within the chimney walls. A deadly, instantaneous flash fire, sending lethal sparks onto the vulnerable thatch roof, igniting the collective doom of the entire village. Too little wood, and the thermal mass of the bricks would collapse, guaranteeing hypothermia and a frigid, agonizing death by dawn, before the sun could offer its meager, distant warmth. The Kochegar navigated this razor's edge, where the margin for error was measured in degrees Celsius and minutes of burn time. The most critical moment in the Kochegar's nightly ritual was the precise execution of the zaklopka, the closing of the damper plate. This had to occur at the exact second the last flame vanished, when the wood was reduced solely to a bed of glowing cherry-red embers, ensuring that no smoke whatsoever remained inside the sealed combustion chamber. Close it even 1 minute too early, and the lingering smoke, starved of oxygen, would flood the dwelling, poisoning them all with the silent killer. Close it 1 minute too late, and the invaluable, irreplaceable heat would simply vanish up the chimney and into the endless void of the Siberian night. Wasted energy, guaranteeing certain death by exposure. That small, rusty metal plate, manipulated with a heavy iron poker, held the entire balance between immediate toxic death, slow freezing, and the continuation of life. The izba itself, the Siberian log cabin, was not merely constructed, it was meticulously engineered as a thermal vault to support this furnace.
Its walls were massive, hand-hewn cedar and pine logs stacked with the precision of a master craftsman. The gaps sealed with thick bundles of naturally insulating moss and clay harvested during the brief, frantic summer thaw. But the genius of Siberian defensive architecture lay beneath the floor. The lower walls and foundation were universally banked deep in snow and compacted earth, a sophisticated natural defense system known as the podpolye. This wasn't just structural reinforcement, it was survival physics in action.
By creating a thermal cushion between the frozen permafrost and the wooden floorboards, the izba maximized the retention of the pechka's radiating heat, preventing the warmth from being sucked downward into the earth. Every tiny crack in the chinking, every exposed knothole, was perceived as a critical wound, an invitation for the great enemy to infiltrate the sanctuary. Maintaining this seal, repairing the structural integrity of the cabin's perimeter in -40 degrees, was a testament to the grinding, relentless human will against the indifferent universe. And within this defended space, one territory was absolutely sacred, absolutely guarded: the Zapechkoi. The Zapechkoi was the space immediately behind, and often atop, the colossal stove itself. This wasn't merely a place to rest, it was the thermal maximum, the only reliably, consistently warm zone in the entire structure, the absolute center of life. This coveted elevated shelf, the pechka leżanka, was reserved exclusively for the most vulnerable, the frail elderly, the sick, and the newest, youngest children, those whose fragile hold on existence would snap instantly if exposed to the inevitable, chilling drafts circulating near the floor. To earn a spot on the pechka shelf was to receive a temporary, blessed reprieve from the constant, soul-destroying siege of the cold. The dry, intense, radiant heat baked the life back into aching, fatigued bones, and, crucially, dried the heavy, often snow-soaked outer garments, though even this process posed a fire hazard if the wet clothes were placed too close to the searing brick. The Kochegar's duty extended even here, requiring constant monitoring of the brick's surface temperature, ensuring the bricks were warm enough to preserve life, but never so hot to scorch the thin straw mattresses or ignite the dreaded fire from within. The heat was a tangible entity, a weapon they wielded with desperate care, and it was perpetually threatening to turn its destructive power against its own masters. The survival of the Siberian village was not a passive endurance. It was a perpetual, high-wire performance of thermal control, where the slightest miscalculation resulted not in discomfort, but in absolute extinction. The performance of thermal control demanded one currency above all others: wood. Without it, the finely tuned clockwork of the izba ground to a halt in less than 6 hours, sometimes less, depending on the ferocity of the Arctic wind. Every family lived by the dreadful arithmetic of the woodpile. They didn't count days, they counted logs, meticulously gauging the density and moisture content of each piece before consigning it to the hungry maw of the pechka. A log pile that looked adequate at sunset could, by the grim calculus of a plummeting mercury, become a death sentence by dawn, forcing desperate, inefficient burning just to maintain the critical temperature gradient necessary for life. The psychological pressure of this perpetual scarcity was a shadow that never lifted from the Siberian soul, a constant, gnawing fear, far colder than the air outside the window, a stress passed down through generations. The supply was never truly secure. It required the great wood haul, a logistical nightmare performed under the very conditions it was meant to stave off, pushing human and animal endurance beyond the breaking point. The deep taiga, the forest, was the source of life, but simultaneously the place where life was most easily extinguished by a simple, cruel twist of fate or weather. To secure enough fuel for even 2 weeks required an undertaking of monumental scale, a caravan of massive, iron-shod sledges, often measuring 10 feet long and heavily reinforced, dragged by the village's most powerful, heavy-breathing draft horses, sometimes requiring teams of 4 or 5 animals working in tandem. These were not casual errands. These were military expeditions into the heart of the deep taiga, where the snow often piled higher than a man's waist, burying even the oldest, most reliable trails beneath miles of pristine, deadly white oblivion, demanding constant pathfinding. The men, wrapped in layers of thick sheepskin shubas and heavy felt boots, valenki, moved with the slow, deliberate pace of those who understood that speed meant risk. A broken axle 20 versts from the nearest smoke meant certain death for the men, trapped and exposed, and the catastrophic loss of the horses, an economic blow from which the village might never recover, condemning dozens to starvation or freezing come the next deep winter. Every journey was a gamble with the enemy itself, a calculated risk that often fell prey to the unpredictable cruelty of the Siberian climate, such as the sudden, localized snow squalls known to appear without warning, capable of swallowing a whole haul team in minutes. The biggest threat during the haul wasn't necessarily the cold itself, provided the men were adequately layered and vigilant, but the insidious, internal threat of sweat. The moment their bodies overheated during the arduous labor felling the gigantic frozen trees and manually loading the tons of timber onto the sledges, the internal moisture would vaporize, only to instantly condense and freeze in the outer layers of their shubas once they paused for rest or to guide the struggling teams. This frozen moisture acted like a layer of solid ice armor, destroying the insulating properties of the wool and fur, initiating a rapid, irreversible descent into fatal hypothermia, a death sentence delivered not by the exterior cold, but by the body's own exertion and the merciless efficiency of physics. Therefore, the pace of the haul had to be agonizingly slow, rhythmic, and carefully managed to prevent any significant rise in core temperature, forcing long, cold breaks between bursts of intense physical labor. When the sledges finally groaned back into the village, their wooden runners screaming protest against the packed snow like tormented spirits, the logs themselves were almost useless until processed. They were not merely frozen. They were diamond hard, saturated with latent ice that had to be meticulously driven out before efficient combustion was possible. A log full of ice would hiss and smolder, consuming heat rather than generating it, an unpardonable waste of effort and energy. This necessity led to the secondary, critical function of the pechka. It became the village's primary thermal processing plant, a silent kiln at the heart of the home. The fresh, icy logs were immediately hauled inside the izba, stacked high along the elevated wooden shelving, the palati, where the family slept, or positioned directly against the stove's massive, radiating brick carapace. This meticulous, energy-intensive process was known simply as sweating the timber, and it consumed the valuable, limited interior space for days at a time. For 2 or 3 days, The intense, radiating heat from the pechka would slowly, deliberately bake the tons of wood, driving the crystalline moisture out into the air of the dwelling, where it would condense as harmless frost on the inner walls. This increased internal humidity was actually desirable, preventing the air from becoming too dry and cracking the occupant's lungs, a necessary side effect of the drying process. But it carried an enormous, immediate, and terrifying danger. As the logs dried, the structure of the wood changed. They became light, brittle, and dangerously volatile, their moisture content dropping rapidly, turning them into pure, concentrated fuel, ready to explode into flame. The margin for error in stoking the pechka shrank to zero during these drying days. A single spark, an ember that managed to jump the metal hearth plate, or an overstoked fire roaring too close to the rapidly desiccating logs stacked nearby, meant the swift and absolute end of the family, and potentially the whole village. Fire, the only thing that could consistently kill the great enemy, was now poised to become an enemy 10,000 times swifter and more absolute, consuming everything in a raging, unstoppable vortex of heat and smoke. The izba was constructed entirely of timber, often sealed with tar and a highly flammable moss. It was fundamentally a tinderbox wrapped in the finest, highly combustible insulation nature could provide. The izba's construction was a silent testament to this fear. The walls, the famous srub, were not just thick, they were a profound study in thermal layering. The inner layers of pine or fir logs were meticulously notched, ensuring an interlocking grip that minimized air gaps, and then sealed with massive quantities of moss, mach, harvested during the brief, violent summer thaw. This moss was not merely sealant, it was a living, breathing component of the thermal envelope, possessing extraordinary insulating properties that effectively created a second, organic layer of defense against the ambient 40-degree world, trapping air and preventing convection. But this organic filler was also highly combustible, turning brittle and dry after years of continuous pechka heat. The very structure designed to save them was perpetually on the precipice of self-immolation, a paradox that haunted every waking hour. The villagers lived in a state of suspended animation between freezing to death and burning alive. The survival of the entire settlement hinged on the mastery of the pechka's draft system, the intricate, delicate interplay of the chimney damper, vyushka, and the air intake, podulovo, demanding the precision of a master clockmaker. Too much draft, and the fire roared, threatening the stacked wood, sending the most valuable asset, stored heat, escaping rapidly up the chimney flue, wasting precious hard-won calories. Too little, and the deadly, invisible threat of carbon monoxide would silently seep into the living space, a sweet, soporific poison, claiming lives while they slept, warm but utterly poisoned, never to wake. The Siberian life was not a pursuit of happiness. It was the pursuit of perfect, agonizingly precise equilibrium between these two fatal extremes. The pechka demanded constant, minute adjustment, a relationship of absolute attention and profound respect, punishing even momentary carelessness with swift oblivion. The fire was a beast that had to be fed, respected, and, most terrifyingly, understood in all its volatile moods. The margin for error remained nil, forcing these peasants to become thermal engineers, masters of material science, and psychological warriors against the looming shadow of extinction, all just to see the next terrifying, bone-achingly cold dawn. The Siberian peasant was a thermal engineer by necessity, but even the greatest engineer can be betrayed by the very system designed to save them. The pechka, the mighty heart of the izba, fought the great enemy outside with relentless fury, but inside its own stone arteries, a new, silent killer was breeding, the black venom known as creosote. This wasn't just soot. This was the highly flammable, tar-like residue of imperfect combustion, a viscous, sticky substance coating the inside of the smoke channels and the chimney flue, thickening with every log of damp, resinous wood they were forced to burn. Every time the peasant, desperate to conserve precious heat, choked the flue prematurely to slow the burn, a necessary tactic for nighttime survival, they were inadvertently painting the inside of their home's lifeline with liquid fire. The danger was compounding, invisible, and terrifyingly inevitable. It was a ticking clock built from carbon and tar, winding tighter and tighter until the moment of catastrophe. The villagers called this buildup saja, and its presence was a psychological burden as heavy as the frozen roof above them. They knew what saja meant. It meant that their salvation could instantly transform into their executioner, triggering an internal inferno that would consume the entire izba and wipe out generations of collected warmth in minutes. The fight for warmth was thus not just a fight against the cold, but a constant, harrowing battle against internal combustion, a domestic war against the physics of fire. This threat demanded the most terrifying routine of all, the annual, sometimes semi-annual, cleaning of the chimney, a ritual performed under conditions of extreme peril. Picture the scene. A midwinter day, the temperature plunging toward -40 degrees, and the wind howling off the endless tundra like a hungry wolf. A man, often the youngest and most agile, or the oldest and most stoic, had to climb onto the slick, snow-dusted, steeply pitched roof. There was no safety harness, no margin for error. One slip on the icy timber meant a bone-shattering fall onto ground frozen harder than granite. This was the realm of the trubochist, not a professional chimney sweep, but a desperate family member wielding rudimentary tools, heavy ropes, weighted brushes crafted from pine boughs, or sometimes specialized scraping tools forged by the village blacksmith. Their mission was simple yet deadly: to scrape the black venom from the very throat of the izba, to relieve the pressure cooker of volatile residue that threatened to blow. Every scrape of the metal was a prayer, every shovelful of collected soot a temporary reprieve from oblivion. The psychological terror of standing on that precipice, clinging to the frozen edge while high winds tried to rip them away, was a testament to the primal fear of the chimney fire. They knew the alternative was instant, catastrophic incineration of their entire family unit. And if they were unlucky enough to miss a spot, if a particularly dense pocket of creosote remained hidden in a crooked flue or a corner of the smoke channel, The result would be a sound that tore the silence of the Siberian night, the sound of a roaring chimney fire. This wasn't the gentle crackle of logs. This was the sound of a freight train accelerating inside the walls, a deafening, terrifying roar as the condensed tars ignited and burned at impossible temperatures. Neighbors would instantly know the sound. In the deep dark, a pillar of fire would suddenly erupt from the chimney top, glowing cherry red against the white snow. Inside the izba, panic was absolute. The stone pechka, normally a source of comforting warmth, radiated a superheated, terrifying aura. The surrounding wooden walls and ceilings would begin to smoke, the timber structure of the izba itself protesting under the sudden thermal shockwave. Immediate action was mandatory, swift and brutal. There was no time to fetch water. The well was likely frozen solid, and even if it wasn't, pouring water onto such a fierce internal fire could crack the stove or turn the water instantly to steam, causing severe burns or worse. The defense was desperate, relying on ancient, visceral knowledge. They grabbed sand, sometimes salt, sometimes even handfuls of snow mixed with ash, and frantically threw it down the open flue, attempting to smother the inferno from above and below, choking the oxygen supply. Meanwhile, outside, family members would be scrambling onto the roof, trying to beat down the sparks erupting from the top before they landed on the adjacent, highly flammable wooden roofs of their neighbors. The danger of structural collapse was immediate, and the horrifying reality was that, in the tightly clustered Siberian villages, one izba fire often meant a chain reaction that consumed the entire settlement, leaving every family instantly exposed to the great enemy, the -50-degree air that granted death in minutes. The maintenance of the pechka was thus a constant negotiation with fate, a thermodynamic gamble where the stakes were always the total annihilation of the household. It wasn't just about feeding the furnace. It was about managing the chemistry of the flame, understanding the deadly byproducts, and constantly mitigating the inherent risk of their singular savior turning into a monstrous destroyer, demanding eternal vigilance against the insidious, fiery black blood of the Saja. The vigilance against the fiery black blood of the Saja was not just a matter of scrubbing. It was a battle fought months in advance, deep in the frozen silence of the taiga, where the true quality of survival was determined by the raw material that fed the beast, the firewood. The villagers knew a terrifying truth. The pechka would accept anything they offered, but if the offering was corrupt, the stove would pay them back with lethal speed, manufacturing the very poison that demanded their lives. They called the most dangerous substance the weeping wood. Timber harvested green, or worse, wood already rotten and saturated with the relentless moisture of the endless Siberian forest floor. Burning this wood was an act of desperation, guaranteeing incomplete combustion, a slow, sputtering suicide that coated the vital arteries of the chimney flues, the democot, with a sticky, carcinogenic black tar that was not just soot, but pure, concentrated creosote, the oil of the devil. This heavy, dark substance, thicker than pitch, clung to the clay and brickwork, drying slowly under the heat until it became brittle, fractured,
and perfectly primed to become a fuse line for a catastrophic chimney fire. The difference between a lifetime of warmth and an instantaneous conflagration often hinged on whether the wood harvested months before had been allowed to season properly, or if the desperate cutters had been forced to take living, weeping saplings just to keep the winter demons at bay.
The only true gold standard was the ancient dry birch, or the hard, dense woods that burned with a clean, roaring white heat, leaving behind only the pure, light gray zola, easy to manage and completely harmless to the flue structure. But these precious, slow-growing hardwoods were finite, guarded secrets of the taiga, often requiring perilous journeys far beyond the village perimeter, tempting the territorial wolves and the even colder stare of the deep winter itself.
Every single log brought back was categorized, inspected, and stored with the meticulous care of a jeweler handling precious stones. The drova, the village firewood stack, was not a simple pile. It was a cathedral of survival, engineered for maximum ventilation and minimal exposure to snowmelt. The elder, or the appointed drova master, had the terrifying authority to dictate which logs were burned when, understanding implicitly that burning 3 days of suboptimal pine meant guaranteeing a week of extreme soot danger later.
The greatest fear was not running out of wood entirely, which meant immediate death by exposure. The greatest fear was running low on quality wood, forcing the community to burn the reserves of weeping wood. When that moment arrived, a palpable dread would settle over the izba. The smell was the first warning, a heavy, cloying, tar-like odor that indicated the smoke was not rising cleanly, but condensing inside the walls, silently building the black armor of destruction. The women would instantly increase their monitoring of the flue temperatures, and the men would begin the dreaded shurov, the preemptive emergency high heat burn, designed to burn off some of the dangerous creosote before it reached critical mass. This was a terrifying gamble. It required temporarily overheating the pechka, forcing the fire to choke itself on air, causing a massive internal surge of heat that might, if everything was aligned just right, vaporize the thinner creosote deposits without igniting the whole chimney.
If the burn was too slow, the creosote would simply bake harder. If the burn was too fast, the surging flame would grab the creosote and turn the democote into a vertical inferno, shooting flames 10 feet above the roofline, a terrifying beacon announcing immediate doom to the neighbors. The izba would often survive the fire itself, thanks to the heavy clay lining and brickwork, but the intense, localized heat would weaken the mortar, creating tiny, invisible fissures, microscopic portals through which the smoke and deadly carbon monoxide could seep into the living space, poisoning the family in their sleep. The izba was designed to breathe, but only according to the rules of the pechka. The quality of the air, the survivability of the night, was directly linked to the chemical composition of the fuel burned hours earlier. The old Siberian adage was grimly true. The pechka does not judge the axe that felled the wood, but it will certainly judge the man who put it in the fire. Every knot, every vein of resin, every drop of moisture
was an input into the delicate equation of survival.
The physical effort of obtaining and processing this fuel was relentless. Chopping, splitting, stacking, the work never ended, even during the deepest cold, because complacency meant instant contamination of the system. The sheer quantity required was astronomical. A moderately sized izba might consume 5 to 10 cords of wood over the 6 to 7 month winter. This was not a resource measured in weight or volume, but in sheer brute manpower and the agonizing calculus of preservation.
The villagers developed methods to test the wood's readiness, sometimes tapping the logs with hardened steel to listen for the sharp, brittle ring of seasoned timber, contrasting it against the dull, sickening thud of the weeping wood. Children were taught this auditory test almost before they could walk, understanding that a mistake in identifying fuel could erase their entire family. This eternal search for the dry, the clean, the perfect caloric engine defined their entire relationship with the forest. It wasn't just a place of game or timber, it was a deadly pharmacy where the difference between life-giving medicine and deadly poison was separated by a single drop of water. The greatest heroes in the village were often the woodcutters, the ones who dared to go deepest and bring back the true warmth, ensuring that when the dreaded sound of crackling fire inside the chimney wall finally came, it was not due to their negligence, but due to the unpredictable malice of the great enemy itself. And always, hanging over every moment of warmth, was the knowledge that even the perfect, clean-burning birch left ash, zola, a secondary byproduct that demanded constant removal, a hot, fine dust that, if improperly handled, could ignite the carefully dried tinder or storage materials, proving that in Siberia, every solution carried the seed of its own destruction. The zola was removed daily, often still glowing red-hot, carried out in specialized metal scoops, and deposited into deep, snow-covered pits, the final, terrifying chapter in the life cycle of the sacred flame. The system was elegant, brutal, and unforgiving, demanding absolute mastery over combustion, chemistry, and fear. The pechka was their heart, and the drova was its terrifyingly specific, life-sustaining blood supply. The slightest compromise in the purity of that fuel meant an immediate, mortal shift in the scales of fate, tilting the izba toward the silent, fiery doom. The wood was set, the smoke was drawn, and now the great beast, the pechka, was finally breathing deep, long breaths of superheated air. It wasn't a quick, searing blaze. That was the kind of fleeting, deceptive heat that betrayed the unprepared man. This was a slow, agonizing accumulation of power, a promise delivered not in minutes of explosive flame, but across the unforgiving, silent stretch of the Arctic night, soaking into the clay and brick like water into sand. The true brilliance of the pechka lay not merely in the firebox, but in the labyrinthine paths the superheated gases were forced to travel before they were finally allowed to escape the roofline. This internal, hidden flue system was the thermal harness, designed by generations who understood that waste was immediate death. Every brick, every slab of heavy clay,
Every inch of its massive monolithic structure was designed to capture, hold, and then relinquish that heat grudgingly, fighting the Siberian vacuum one radiant calorie at a time. The outer surface of the stove might only reach a comfortable, deep warmth, suitable for sleeping upon, but inside, the winding chimney channels were brief infernos, continuously storing the energy that kept blood flowing in the extremities of the family.
But the pechka, mighty as it was only half the equation. It generated the life-giving warmth. The izba had to keep it locked away, like a miser hoarding his last ruble. The walls were not just stacked pine logs. They were a calculated, brutal defense against the forces of annihilation. The thick, tightly joined pine logs, often interlocked using the complex oblo method, provided the necessary structural strength. But they were merely the skeleton. The critical layer was the chinking, the moss, clay, and sometimes animal dung mixture, meticulously packed into every crack and seam, creating a biological, breathing blanket against the penetrating frost. If a fissure appeared, if the clay shrunk from a season of brutal dryness, the great enemy didn't just walk in, it stabbed. A pencil-thin stream of -40-degree air was a lethal, localized ice dagger aimed directly at the sleeping heart of the room, forcing the temperature to plummet near the floorboards. The roof, heavy and low-pitched, was another masterpiece of necessity, engineered from layers of bark and earth. Birch bark provided essential water resistance, but the true defense lay in the dense layer of sod or earth packed over the wooden frame. This immense, heavy burden wasn't just weatherproofing. It was the crucial insulation against the heat escaping upward, the natural path of surrender and thermal dissipation. Even the floor, usually elevated slightly off the permafrost on low foundation stones or blocks, required constant vigilance. A deep layer of packed earth beneath the rough-cut planks minimized the devastating, chilling creep from the ground, known to the villagers as the foot of the serpent, which sought to steal warmth from below and freeze the moisture in the lowest air strata. Survival was not about comfort. It was about constant, obsessive monitoring of the house's metabolic state. Every head of the household, every khozyaika, had the thermal pulse of the izba calibrated to their very soul, sensing change long before frost flowers formed on the interior of the window panes. The ultimate luxury, the ultimate sign of a successful thermal fortress, was the polati. This wide, raised wooden sleeping shelf, built high above the stove and sometimes directly adjacent to the chimney mass, was the single warmest place in the entire house, the highest trapped air providing a precious thermal blanket against the cold floor. To sleep on the polati was to taste victory over the darkness, to experience the closest thing to tropical warmth Siberian life offered. But it was also the first place to suffer if the pechka's energy supply failed, turning the elevated platform into a refrigerated mausoleum within hours, trapping the unwary in the coldest reaches of the ceiling. The children slept there, trusting implicitly in the structural engineering of their parents and the endurance of the wood. The parents, however, slept lightly, their subconscious minds eternally tracing the lines of the walls, listening for the faint, treacherous hiss of cold air breaching the moss seal. Yet, the engineering of perfect heat distribution required one final, terrifying act of timing. The ultimate danger lay in the management of the chimney damper, the vyushka. This seemingly simple, heavy metal plate was the difference between life, peaceful sleep, and instantaneous, unseen death.
The pechka was designed to burn hot and quick, to fully combust the dangerous gases. Once the wood had reduced entirely to glowing embers, once the visible smoke had completely vanished, signaling the absolute end of the incomplete combustion phase, the damper had to be closed to prevent heat escape.
If the damper was closed even minutes too soon, before the deadly carbon monoxide, the dreaded silent killer they only knew as the sleep of the smoke, had fully cleared the system, the house became an undetectable poison gas chamber. The sleeping family would simply never wake up from the silent, odorless embrace of the ugarnikas. This deadly byproduct was a threat far more insidious than the cold itself, because it attacked the body without sensation, without sound, without even the warning smell of smoke. It was the pechka's ultimate, necessary betrayal, the cost of efficiency. But if the damper was left open too long, that precious, hard-won heat, the accumulated thermal mass of the entire structure, would be sucked violently up the chimney flue, replaced by a vacuum of frigid Siberian air, destroying the izba's thermal equilibrium and rendering all previous efforts moot in mere minutes. The decision to close the vyushka was therefore the most critical, high-stakes judgment call made in the village every single night. It was a perfect measure of the moisture content in the wood, the ambient outside temperature, the precise timing of the ember's final glow. A calculation honed by a lifetime spent gambling against two competing forms of total oblivion. Too early. Death by poison. Too late. Death by instantaneous thermal crash. The margin for error was often measured in less than 5 minutes of perfect timing, demanding an intuition few outside these frozen latitudes could ever possess. It was this constant, brutal negotiation with physics and fate that defined the Siberian existence. They were not just surviving the weather, they were executing a flawless, high-stakes engineering protocol, twice daily, every day, until spring offered its brief, mocking reprieve.